Hi, everyone on all of the online platforms that you may be joining us on. Welcome to this virtual TC Jewfolk Campfire Conversation. I'm Lev Gringauz, a contributing writer for TC Jewfolk and host of the Jewish news podcast, The Jews Are Tired. It's an obvious fact, but still a jarring one, that the COVID-19 pandemic has turned the Jewish world upside down. Our synagogues are closed, our prayers are set on calls and video chats, and our programming is all online. But I think in many ways that despite those challenges, the transition from physical gathering to virtual gathering has been done pretty well across Jewish communities. But one of the things that does not transition easily to virtual space is Jewish summer camp. Camp is camp because of the joy in physically building community and bonfires and throwing color wars, having song sessions. Tens of thousands of kids each summer go to camp to learn to be better versions of themselves and to connect with their friends, community, and Judaism. And this summer, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, tens of thousands of kids are losing that experience. Jewish summer camps have had to navigate the difficult and sudden change in circumstances. Some have closed for the summer. Others have delayed start times and are working to find ways to stay open. Many are struggling financially, if not all, as they try to figure out what comes next. So our conversation today is about the decision-making process that camps have either gone through or are going through about summer 2020. I'm fairly confident in saying that whenever any Jewish professional makes any decision about anything, community members have lots of questions. So we hope that this conversation offers some answers. And our guests today, and I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your evening to be here, are Drea Lear, the camp director of Herzl Camp, an independent overnight camp in Wisconsin that is closed for this summer. Jacob Citron, the executive director of Camp Ramah in Wisconsin, an overnight and day camp affiliated with the conservative movement that is still deciding what the summer will look like. Solly Kane, the director of OSRUI, an overnight camp in Wisconsin affiliated with the reform movement that is closed for this summer. Ali Greenstein, the director of Camp Olami, a JCC camp in Minnesota that is still figuring out the summer. Ben Savin, the director of Camp Butwin, a JCC day camp in Minnesota that is still also figuring out the summer. And Abby Kirschbaum, the director of Camp TEKO, a day camp affiliated with the Reform Temple Israel congregation in Minnesota that is closed for this summer. Also on the call to make sure everything runs smoothly is Lonny Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk, who will also be helping out with audience questions. So with so many participants, let me just explain how we're going to do the conversation and keep things focused. I've got a few questions written down that we'll spend about 45 minutes on. Each question will be addressed to a few of you, but not all of you unless otherwise specified. And the idea is to have at least one overnight and one day camp answer each question. But any one of you can jump in if you would like to once the question has been answered by the people it was meant for. And then we'll have audience questions for roughly the last 15 minutes. Fully acknowledging that we've got all kinds of camp backgrounds here with all kinds of conversations and topics we might miss, but the idea here is to hopefully develop a bigger picture conversation about decision-making in the Jewish camping world right now. And for anyone watching the stream right now, this conversation is being recorded and a version of it will appear on the Jews Are Tired podcast next week. So, having said all of that, let's get to the questions. The first question I have is for Drea and Ali. Let's start just by breaking down the process and the timeline of decision-making. Rewinding to about 2 months ago, can each of you say a little bit about, for each of your camps, who did or do you go to, to start answering this question of what are we going to do about camp this year given the situation, and what were and are those conversations like? So whichever one of you wants to take that away.
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe I unmuted first, right? And I also want to start by thanking Jewfolk for hosting this conversation. Those of us in the camping field have obviously been talking to colleagues for a long time, and we certainly want to be able to answer community questions as well. For us, pretty early on, so early in March, my first call was to the Herzl Camp Medical Committee. So we have a committee of medical professionals who advise and guide us on camp operations, sign off on things that need a medical professional's signature during the summer, help us think through processes and procedures in our health center, as well as public health things at camp. And so they were really my first call to get a sense of what were we looking at, what were we talking about here. And so from there, we obviously, set up calls in the future, because back in March, feels like we knew, less and also simultaneously more than what we do now. It's very strange. Definitely less though at that point. And from there, we then went to a small committee made up of board members from the Herzl Camp, organization, which we call our COVID steering committee, which was made up of, financial folks. There were some programmatically minded people. We added in the voices of our medical committee. And that's really where we started, and started having weekly check-in meetings. Obviously, as things were changing so rapidly, we wanted to make sure we stayed on top of it. And so that's where we turned to internally first. And then, we also pretty early on started reaching out to our colleagues in the overnight and day camping world, just to really start brainstorming. At the time, we were balancing between planning for, myriad contingencies with coronavirus, and also planning for camp as scheduled. And so trying to balance those two things and dividing and conquering, and getting support from our community, like our professional community, was incredibly helpful, incredibly comforting, and also I think challenged us in the right ways to think through all of the different details, some of which we may have come to on our own, and some of which we certainly would not have, particularly as it relates to our medical committee. They were instrumental in helping us understand what our options were.
To speak for day camps, I would echo a lot of what Drea said. Back in March, this all looked so different for so many of us, and obviously we were super hopeful that camp would go on as planned. We also had started those contingency conversations very early on, and I would say our first go-to, the St. Paul and Savas JCCs have been working really closely together. So Ben and I had lots of conversations pretty early on about what summer could look like, and planning contingency plans for abbreviated summers, planning contingency plans for in-person camp with social distancing, planning lots of different scenarios and thinking through what lots of those might look like. Additionally, we have been working with a safety consultant who works for the St. Paul JCC, but also is doing a lot of work with the Savas JCC, who has reached out to lots of different medical professionals and has been the one to really dive into the CDC guidelines and the information available to us from the Department of Health and the governor and all of those things. And he's been able to compile lots of it and put a plan in place for what camp would look like should we be able to run. In addition to that, I would say we sat on lots of calls with the American Camping Association, and in addition, the JCC Association, and found, those conversations were really helpful to be able to network and connect with lots of other professionals dealing with the same conversations, and to springboard ideas amongst one another and talk about, how we can make a meaningful camping experience, knowing what the expectations were, in order to make sure that we were able to maintain the health and safety of our campers, our staff, our family, and the integrity of our program.
Does anyone else want to, jump in on that or add at all to, that part of the conversation about those early stages, who you were talking to and what those conversations were like? Okay, then sort of building off of that, you know, let's talk about the timeline. You know, and this is a question for Jacob and Abby. How do you figure out the timeline of making a final decision with so many things in flux? I mean, for your camps, how did you, or do you, decide the line between, you know, let's give it another week to see what our options are, and we need to get our campers, parents, and staff an answer now? If you know, whoever wants to go first, Jacob or Abby.
I'll go. Yeah, that was definitely a very the hardest part of this. You know, we wanted to give an answer and we didn't know. And so how do we come up with a timeline that's going to satisfy everyone and give us the appropriate information and make sure that we're covering all of our bases and we know the right decision. And to be honest, you know, this is all uncharted territory, and how will we ever know? And as our governor has been saying so wonderfully and beautifully, if at the end of this we say, wow, we overreacted, that's great. You know, like, that's what we want. We want to have overreacted to save more lives and to help more people and to stop the spread of the disease. I think for us, you know, it was very clear that there were a lot of things that have to get done before camp starts. You know, our training for our staff members was not something I was willing to compromise on. I was not willing to do that online. I don't think that would be as effective, especially for a summer where kids are, you know, this is it's a transition year for them. It's a very difficult summer for them, a very difficult year for them. And not to be able to give staff appropriate training was not something that I was willing to compromise on. And so I think with that kind of gave us a little bit of a basis of what this looks like. So I have 2 weeks of staff training. You know, I needed at least a week in the office to print things, you know, or anything like that. As well as making sure our facility was taken care of appropriately, and, you know, how many people need to take care of the facility. So kind of working backwards from that and knowing, you know, we can't open if we're able to open, and, you know, if we were able to be in groups of 100 or something, you know, in July, I still need 3 or 4 weeks to get stuff going, and then we're already in August. You know, and does that make sense? So I think that was a big piece for me.
From our perspective, I mean, part of this is almost exactly what Abby said. You know, back planning. You know, what are the different levers? My guess is Juri Ansali would agree with me on this. We got really lucky that things started shutting down in the middle of March and not in the middle of April. Because we would have started making significant investments, signing contracts, buying food, getting camp up and running, at least for the overnight camps, in early April. That would have put us really in a much scarier financial position, and would have made a lot of these questions much more difficult for us to navigate. And so we initially made a decision that we wanted to give ourselves about a month before we would normally go up to camp. I would be heading up to camp right around June 1st. And so we committed to making an announcement at first by May 1st. And then shortly thereafter, different senior staff would come up, et cetera. And, you know, I will say that the optimism in the field early on was for a national response. Really at the federal level, that there would be an investment in testing, that there would be a reliance on guidelines from the Centers for Disease Control, that the American Camp Association, which I think accredits all of our camps, would have been able to translate the CDC guidelines. And really, as April bore on, it became so clear that so much of this was going to become politicized. And clearly what's happened in Wisconsin, for those of us who have camps in Wisconsin, over the last 2 or 3 days is really frightening and scary. And it's different than the lives that some of us are living in Illinois and Minnesota. And so as time went on, we were waiting, and we were counseled by the American Camp Association, by the Foundation for Jewish Camp, to wait as long as possible. And we were hoping. And as things have continued to develop, that hope is more and more difficult to hold on to. The last point I would just make is, because the pandemic is national and global, for me personally, it has changed the calculus of feeling like our staff and parents need to know about camp, right? If there were, God forbid, a localized outbreak of a communicable disease in northern Wisconsin, and we had to shut, there'd be all sorts of other camping options out there. The nature of the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and social distancing makes it such that we're all kind of held hostage, literally in our four walls of where we live, but also just in terms of these different options. And just honestly, I think some, if not all of us, would have felt pressure to make decisions earlier and earlier had the dynamics in the region and in the country been a little different.
Yeah. Does any other director want to jump in on that? Okay. That's something, the point about, everyone experiencing this, and it's an interesting point you raise about the timeline sort of not mattering as much. We're going to come back to that with a question later as well. So now, to this question is for Solly and Ben. When it came to planning out the different options of what summer could have or will look like, how did your camps go about that? I mean, I see this question as, a question about how you've approached the uncertainty of this situation. I mean, when you're watching what happened, was happening in the country, did you say, okay, we know these are our couple options, one of these seems most likely, let's focus on that one? Or did you manage, the investment in several options and then, wait to see what stuck?
Sure, I can speak to that. Just want a quick shout out TC Jewfolk. Thank you guys for hosting us and this amazing team of camp professionals that's here today. I feel very fortunate to have this community of professionals around me. I think that really goes back to the timeline issue. And as we started in March, seeing more and more about this COVID-19 pandemic and started to think more and more about how that might impact our summers, and it seemed far away, and then it all of a sudden seemed very close. I think the biggest experience that I felt I had in planning was planning for so many different contingencies at once, because there was certainly a period of time where we were worried, we were frightened, we were curious, but we were also seeing camp as that light at the end of the tunnel and working super, super hard like we always do all year long to have an amazing, amazing summer ready to go for our campers and our staff and our families when opening day rolled around. And, mid-June, at least for the day camps, that's when we were planning on opening. It seemed at a certain point like it would be pretty realistic. Now, as we learned more and as time passed, we became more and more aware that this thing wasn't necessarily just going to go away. And at that point, it started to be a matter of looking at different contingencies. What would it look like if we opened later in the summer? What would it look like if we opened for a smaller amount of campers? What would camp look like with social distancing? And starting to plan for what camp is going to look like if we can run it as usual, what camp is going to look like if we can run it, but it's going to be a very different way. And then starting to think about that inevitability or that, possible contingency of what if we have to cancel camp entirely? How are we going to communicate that to our families, and how are we going to process that ourselves? I think working at the JCC, I feel really fortunate that we have this amazing team of professionals that support us in making those decisions and in looking at the different factors at play. And one really awesome, maybe I'll say silver lining out of this, is I think that we're aware that the two JCCs have partnered in a different way in the past months, and this has brought the camp teams and I think the J teams closer together faster than anyone ever would have imagined. It's been so, so great to see that happen and see our staff come together and pool resources. But it was hard for a period of time. It was really, really hard to feel like we were planning, as camp directors and trying to imagine and envision what all of these different contingencies could look like, and trying to be as ready as possible for any different number of them. So again, thankful for the team behind us and the team supporting us for, help in, determining a course of action. Obviously with the ACA and the JCC Association providing guidance as well.
I'll jump in. Let me first add my thanks to you, Lev, and to the TC Jewfolk team for bringing us all together, and nice to be with a great group of friends and colleagues this evening. To echo a lot of the things that others have already said, these are challenging conversations and decisions for camps, and we worked closely with our sister camps across the country in the reform movement, the 15 URJ camps across the country, along with all the other partner organizations that others have mentioned. And there were really three paths forward from the beginning. Go, we're going to have camp this summer. No go, we're not going to have camp this summer, or some sort of modified open where camp's going to start late. And each of those within them had any number of permutations and paths. And all of us were kind of trying to work across those three buckets and within all the different paths. From an overnight camp perspective, when we were thinking about what does it look like to go, there's so many pieces that go into it. How do you have the right procedures for your health center? How do you have protocols in your dining hall? Are you able to have the supply chain to get enough food for your dining hall? What does it look like when you have vendors, visitors to camp, staff members who are hourly, who live local, who are coming and going? What does opening and closing day look like? Trips, etc. All these different pieces that make up camp. Everything that all of us have protocols around had to be re-looked at as we were thinking about what does it mean to go. On the no-go front, what are we weighing as we make that decision that would say, in fact, this doesn't work for us? One outcome that's the easiest outcome is for there to be federal or state or local regulations that say you can't have camp. Then that decision's made for us. That hasn't been the case really across the board in this part of the country. So all of us are then left kind of weighing the different factors. For us in making the decision, we try and do everything by leading with our values and our deep care for the health and well-being of our kids, and that's ultimately what led to the decision that we made to not have camp this summer. The third path, what does it look like to modify camp for the summer? That was also something we were exploring. What if we start late? What if we shorten sessions? And we're a camp where we have lots of different options, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So we were playing out all sorts of different scenarios of if camp is 2 weeks shorter or 3 weeks shorter, how do we redraw our session map and give as many kids as possible the opportunity to come to camp and get that experience that they're looking for. So those are the kinds of things that we were thinking about kind of in parallel at the same time.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that? Okay, then to sort of start capping and bringing the conversation about decision making to right now, this question is for Drea, Solly, and Abby, whose camps will not be operating this summer. Can you tell us a little bit more specifically about, what the final day or, couple of days of decision making was like? What was the moment where it finally stuck that, camp is closed for the summer? And I mean, what went through your mind?
Yeah, I'll give my showstopper, as I call it. I'm like, this is the mic drop moment for me. So at camp, we have one facility, the Hadar Ochel, that has a bathroom in it. So whenever there is a lightning storm, all of our kids everyone at camp, not all of the kids, everyone, go into the Hadar Ochel, and that is our safe space. A lightning storm, you can maybe predict it, maybe you can't. You can't. And during Gimel, our biggest session, we have 170 campers, 20 junior counselors, and at least 50 staff. So what's that number? 240 people inside one building. Social distancing is going to be happening until August. I believe that, and that wouldn't work, and we would be compromising safety on two ends. And it just kind of was the mic drop for me, and was like, even if we, could socially distance in some way, which would totally compromise the program and the integrity of the program, we couldn't keep them safe. Yeah, and I think particularly those last couple of days, personally, I felt very put together in the beginning of all of this, the first couple of months, and then the day that I shared it with everyone on Thursday, oh my God, it really hit. So clearly, for all of us, not an easy decision. And those last couple of days really, my emotions reminded me how hard this was and how necessary it was.
Sure. So the URJ, the Reform Movement camps, were the first large movement to come out together and make an announcement about the summer. We announced on April 30th that collectively the 15 URJ camps serving 10,000 campers were not going to have camp this summer. Getting to that moment, it was a decision that we were certainly honing in on in the weeks leading up to it and finalizing in the few days beforehand. And then it was a pretty carefully coordinated moment across all of our camps so that our kids, whether they're going to OSRUI in Wisconsin or one of our sister camps, Harlem in Pennsylvania or Newman in California, families were finding out at the same time. We had conversations with stakeholders, with congregations, with our boards, and immediately there's a moment of pivot of going from decision-making mode to going to support mode. And kind of once that email goes out, for us, we have 1,000 kids in the summer who were just as heartbroken as all of us were on the full-time staff. And how can we immediately start to support them and their families? And we had a series of webinars over the next few days, a town hall for our community to come together, a Shabbat gathering, opportunities for parents to talk with our camper care team. And then we spent the next week reaching out to families and our summer staff members individually to check in on them and hear how they were doing.
Really similar for us, and it's actually one of the things that I love about this industry, that we all do things in our with our own brand, but at our core we are kin, and I just love that. So our process looked and felt really similar to Sally's, in that it was a really coordinated effort, of course not across a variety of camps, but across our different stakeholder groups. We had spent the 2 weeks prior to that decision communicating with different stakeholders. So, our board members and community members, our parents, our staff, our OSRUI, the staff in training, just to bring them into our thought process. And so for about 2 weeks before the decision was officially made and communicated out, we had just been sharing information and, the things that we know, the things that we don't know, and the information that we still felt that we needed in order to make an official decision. And that process was really therapeutic for me, for lack of a better word, just to be able to bring other people into a thought process. And even though as we were having those conversations, there were no decisions made, we were still learning new information. It felt like as a community, we were learning together. And so when it came time for us to communicate our decision, like Sally said, you go from decision mode to support mode. For us, right? It was the click of a send button that we did that, and I think being able to process with our community was an incredibly meaningful experience for me. And in the weeks since we have communicated the decision for Herzl Camp, we've heard such beautiful stories of resilience and support across the board. We've also been calling camper families, connecting in with staff, a variety of we call it Community Care Week, and that process of communal learning, I think, was what made that more seamless for us than I anticipated it being.
So then, as a question then aimed for Jacob, Ali, and Ben, for some camps, the timeline of, what's happening during the summer physically is stopped, but, for you, the timeline is still going of, figuring out what's going to happen. So, on the note of that timeline, what's your checklist for running camp this summer? What are the things you need to have to say, yes, we can do this? What are your deal breakers? And how are you approaching communicating all of that to parents who may be concerned about the risk of camp running? So again, that's for Jacob, Ali, and Ben.
I'd be happy to jump in, and I'm sure Ali will supplement any of my JCC related statements. I think that one of the opportunities that we may have as day camps is that in some cases, the type of infrastructure that we need to open may be different than some of our colleagues in overnight camps. Now, that's not always the case because every camp is different. But, I think our hope, and I want to be clear that when I say hope, I mean, we hope, but we don't promise. But our hope would be that if things take a correct shift, and as we get guidelines that we have not yet received, that, perhaps we would be able to make a decision to open in some capacity. Right now, as one of my colleagues stated previously, at one point it seemed like we were going to be getting guidance and support on a national level in terms of guidelines and recommendations from the CDC, from the ACA, and those have been, now delayed. And at a certain point, it became unrealistic and didn't feel safe to commit to opening on opening day as scheduled. Our feeling is that we want to give ourselves a little bit more time and our community a little bit more time to continue to evaluate the situation with the virus, as well as take a deep dive into some recommendations as they do become available, hopefully in the coming week or weeks, before we make any final decisions. But we also know that our families are hungry for information. So right now we're committed to ongoing communication on a weekly basis, or in some cases on a more often than weekly basis, to do our best to keep people informed that even sometimes a message that doesn't have concrete information is a data point that can be useful, that we know that people are eager to hear from us and that we are keeping people as informed as possible. And of course, that extends to our staff, as well as our campers and our families, as well as the children they send to camp. And I mean, I think for us as well, and summer is right around the corner.
I think just to build on that a little bit more, we, and Ben and I have this conversation on a daily basis, that while every camp and every person who's sitting at the table today runs a very different program, at the end of the day, we're here to provide a camp experience. And like Drea said, like, we are a community at the end of the day who is looking to provide, a meaningful summer experience for kids to take risks, to figure out who they are as people, as Jews, as so many other things. And so not only is that at the heart of our decision, but even more so, the health and safety is truly our main focus as we're continuing to make these decisions and gain more information. And while, like Ben said, that time will allow us and give us more planning time, and as we're thinking about the communication that we're putting out there, I was reflecting on that conversation, or that question that you asked earlier, Lev, about what the thought process was when the directors sent emails about those closures. And for me, sending an email saying that we're closing for a session, which is absolutely heartbreaking, but to keep this piece of hope that potentially later in the summer that we would be able to open, was a really interesting experience for me, and a lot of back and forth, and in some ways confusing emotions. But it was hard to balance the providing a space to process and also remaining hopeful that the possibility is still out there that as we gain more information and have more planning time, that we could potentially open, and continuing with all those thought processes in mind, that we would not put ourselves in a position, let me rephrase, that we would only be opening if we felt strongly and confidently that the modifications that we can make are attainable, and that will really continue to ensure every single camper's safety and every staff member's safety. And when campers go home at night, that they're continuing to be safe beyond the 8 hours of our traditional camp day.
Jacob, can you hear us?
Hey, can you hear me, Lev?
Yeah, we got you back.
Hear you from. Still talking about timelines?
Yeah. Just to revisit the question, basically, what's your checklist for running camp this summer? The things you need to have, what are your deal breakers, and how are you approaching communicating all of that to parents who may be concerned about camp running?
Great. Apologies if I repeat things, just some technical difficulties over here. So we've been thinking about 3 different categories of concerns. The first category is really kind of those red lines without which we couldn't run camp. That's state and county backing. It's guidelines that we believe we can follow from the ACA. It's a guarantee of food supply, which has become a thing for the overnight camps, things like flour and eggs and other staples. It's our insurance company committing that they can cover us for the summer. That kind of cluster of mostly governmental and regulatory approaches with, clearly some practicalities. So that's the answer to the question, can we open camp? And then there are 2 categories of should we open camp. So even if everything goes right on that first category, and we legally could open, then we get into kind of more subjective territory. And the first category there, and this goes back to something Juria said at the very beginning, is a public health question. The basic guidelines that the ACA approves may or may not be sufficient enough to give our medical subcommittee a feeling of comfort and confidence in running camp. What are those procedures that we're going to enact? What are those policies? Are they livable? Do we think they're reasonable? All of those questions. And then a second category in the should factor, and this piggybacks a little bit off of something Sally mentioned, is really questions about our values, who we are as Camp Ramah, Wisconsin. Will the program that we run from, in line with what everybody's told us to, will that feel like a summer at camp? Will that allow us to live our holistic, joyful Jewish living? Allow us to welcome a broad community of kids and staff of different ages with different backgrounds, to be the inclusive community that we want to be. And so there's a series of those questions that are also at play. And, look, I think for all of us, I'll say, well, my guess is I'm speaking for all of us, but I can't actually, say that. I love camp. I have a great time. I'm a camp guy. I've spent 28 straight summers at camp. And ultimately in my job today, it's all about keeping our kids and staff safe and healthy. And so that's a place where I think if if I'm able to feel comfortable opening up camp, vast majority of families will probably trust us on that front. Those are the conditions that they send their children to us in a normal year. And clearly, ultimately, they have to make the final decision on that. And we don't judge anybody, whether camp professional or parent, for deciding not to send their kids, or for deciding to send their kids. But it's going through this process, and it's communicating openly and honestly with families as we get answers to these questions, that allows us to lay the groundwork for opening.
So then to pivot off of the conversation of, right now, we've covered sort of the past couple months of decision making. We talked about right now. But now, let's sort of open up the question to whoever wants to answer. This one is future facing. So, whether delayed or shut down, there's a massive effort right now to get camp programming online and accessible for the summer. For, anyone who wants to jump in, what would that look like? I mean, in broad strokes, what should campers and parents expect out of virtual camp programming? And what is the process for you of, figuring that out and making it happen?
I'll go. Yeah. So we are operating TEKO Butwin this summer, TEKO at home. And I think, a lot of the things I'm hearing from parents is like, oh my goodness, my kids are zoomed out. I want them to be outside. And like, me too. I want your kids to be outside. I do not want them on the computer all day by all means. And the way that we're structuring our programming, we have about 2.5 hours of accessible online Zoom calls per day. And then we'll also have 2 videos that families will have access to and can do kind of on their own time, like an Amanut video, an art video, and either a sports or a Teva, a nature video. And we're just really excited that we will be able to provide space of friendship and connection, as well as Jewish identity, and to continue on in some sort of fashion, and to provide a space. In no way, shape, or form am I saying that this is camp and that your kid should be on Zoom all day. This is the best consolation prize I can think of, and it sure is a consolation prize. Yeah, so I think it's just important for me to just share, as I've already said twice, I want your kids outside this summer if that's accessible to them.
Does anyone else want to jump in?
I think Abby really said it. That's really similar to our thought process as well. I think we work at camp, like Herzl staff, myself, and, without speaking for my colleagues, we work at camp because we like to be outside in person in this immersive experience. And I think, going into it and putting aside the shoulds, what should we be doing? What should our communities expect? The shoulds are tricky in this world right now, and in this camping world right now. And so just thinking really intentionally about how we can maximize and capitalize on the things that camp does really well, right? Connection, community, feeling a sense of something larger than oneself, and that pride in Jewish identity, and figuring out the authentic engagement opportunities that our community can have access to over the course of the summer. So really figuring out what that looks like is our MO right now.
So just to maybe push on that a little bit more, would any of you be willing to offer any sort of example of a specific program that you're, trying to figure out how to make work at home and the inner workings of that? I'm not going to make you by any means, but, is there any level of specificity that any of you would be willing to speak to?
Sure. Al, you go.
I was just going to say, I don't have specific examples for you in this moment, only because, we're still in ongoing conversations and are getting excited and ready to launch it soon. That said, we are, like Abby said, we want kids to get outside. We know that in and of itself is such a key element of summer experience. And so we want to do as many things as we can to encourage that happens. Additionally, we know that camp is a form of childcare in a lot of ways, especially day camp. And so, to be able to provide, like Drea was saying, those engagement opportunities that make it feel like camp, and in addition to provide some activities that we're trying to balance between, we know families are working full-time jobs in addition to being parents, and now in addition to being counselors. And so figuring out that balance between providing some meaningful content and also some self-directed content, especially for the kids that come to day camps, being that they're entering kindergarten. And so while so independent in some ways, not completely, not like a 17-year-old. And so so figuring out what kinds of programming we can offer to make sure that that we're not asking so much of our families, so that they can get the things that they need to done, and also allow for an opportunity for our campers to be part of our Camp Olami community, or any camp community, and engage that way.
I would say specifically, so I was working on a program today with a colleague that I just want to share, and something we have kind of honed in on is knowing that less is more, and knowing for ourselves an hour-long Zoom call is really long. And at least with me, I've seen a lot of my colleagues at our religious school and our ECC teach all day long, and I've taught too. I work with our youth groups, and it is exhausting. If I have 3 youth groups events in a day, I prepare for that, and so knowing that short and sweet for our staff to make sure that our energy is up, as well as for our families, and knowing that our kids' energy is going to go down throughout the length of the Zoom call. So specifically today, we are working on virtual bonfire and song session. But we literally, I'm going to give away all my secrets, but we Googled campfire loop, and we found a loop, and we're like, okay, we'll screen share. We'll do maybe a bit about how to make a s'more, or how to make a hot dog, whatever it is. If we need to do it in the microwave, we can do it in the microwave. And then we'll do a song, we'll do a discussion question, another song, another discussion question, and another song. And because, that's about half an hour. And it'll be lovely, and it'll be campy, and it won't be too much. And hopefully that'll make it meaningful. So I hope that helps with some of the specifics.
That was great. Now we have at least one audience question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Lonny is going to help me out on this one because he's got that and I do not. So
Okay, perfect. Jacob, this one is for you regarding the TEKO program at Ramah, and what that program might look like in light of, everything else that's going on, and how you factor the importance and the needs of that program and its participants into the bigger discussion with what happens with the end of camp this year.
Great. Great. So for those who don't know, Camp Ramah, Wisconsin, and really all the Ramah camps at this point in time run programs for campers with disabilities and inclusion programs. And our program at Ramah, Wisconsin focuses on mostly kids with social and emotional challenges who spend the summer at camp. Our approach to virtual programming is very much going to focus on basically the core of the Camp Ramah in Wisconsin experience, which is the age group, what we call the ADA. And so instead of running kind of day-long programming for everybody, we're going to offer a day of programming where different sections at different groups. And in addition to that, a number of weeks that we kind of keep a lot more of, kind of specialty stuff. Our TICFA campers and other inclusion groups will be invited to their age groups specific programming. And we're also working with the Director of Special Needs Programs, Ralph Schwartz, and some of our staff in that program as well, to look at kind of another tier of going virtual opportunities for TICFA campers.
All right. Well, it looks like Jacob might have froze. I wasn't sure if he was wrapping up or not. But we got one last question I think we have time for, and that is going to be for really Ben, I think. In terms of the what a camp would look like question, one of the really neat things about Butwin is that because it's an offsite camp, it's the St. Paul JCC camp, but it's offsite, and there is busing to camp. Are there any discussions of what guidelines look like in order to maybe keep kids spaced out further in terms of maybe having to add more buses to keep kids spaced out a little bit more? Is that something that's part of the discussion at this point?
Great. To whoever out there on our stream who asked that question, that is a great question, and it might be the question. So short answer, yes, there are many, many discussions about that that have been going on for weeks and weeks and weeks at this point, because before we can have an amazing, amazing time at Camp Butwin, we need to be able to get to camp. And then at the end of the day, we need to get back from camp. And we need to make that a safe experience, and we need to make that a fun experience. And we need to make that an experience that we can do in a fiscally responsible way, wherein we're not hiring 30 or 40 buses. So what I can tell you is we're looking at it from many different angles. We are still awaiting some more specific guidelines on what transportation can and should look like. And we most certainly will be taking those guidelines very, very seriously. And that could be the factor in if we open or not. I mean, if we can't get the kids there safely, then we're not going to be able to do it. And that is something we're totally okay with. If that's the deciding factor, because as I think we all agree on here, I think I can speak for my colleagues on this, if nothing else, safety is number one every single summer. So we've had some pretty creative brainstorm sessions, and we're obviously in touch with our transportation company as well. And I think, our goal is if and when we do make that decision to open, which we hope we can, and we're still evaluating, we most certainly will be keeping our families very informed as to what they should expect from camp and what the new different processes and protocols might look like. And that would definitely include what they should expect at the buses each day. I won't go into the lunacy of some of the ideas that I've had, but we certainly have approached it from some creative angles. So great question.
So on that note, we've reached our time, and I just want to thank all of you, both to you, the participants, and also the audience members who've been watching and listening along, or will be either in future days listening along, for taking time out of your evenings to be here. And thanks, of course, to TC Jewfolk for hosting this event. For those looking to stay updated on how COVID-19 is affecting the Jewish community in Minnesota and the Midwest, you can find TC Jewfolk on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course at the TC Jewfolk website. Jewfolk podcasts, including The Jews Are Tired, can be found on all streaming platforms. And I just want to finish up with, the last thought of this has not been and is not an easy conversation, and it's not a fun conversation. but it's important that our communities know and understand what's going on and why things are happening the way that they are. So, thank you all again for a great and really candid conversation. And I guess in the spirit of camp, as we all move forward, may you all be blessed as you go on your way, and may you be guided in peace in the decisions that you are making.